Okay, so our notes on the war in the Pacific. So you will need to start in your notes on slide number 30. It should look like the one I have pulled up on the screen for you. And as you can recall, we've been talking about the war in Europe in class. And I told you a couple of days ago, or whenever it was, a couple of weeks ago, that we would cover the war in Europe and then we would backtrack and cover the war in the Pacific. All this was going on at roughly the same time as some of the stuff we talked about during the European theater of World War II. So keep that in mind. America is fighting on two fronts during this war. And we're probably the only country that honestly could do that because of our manpower, because of our resources, and so forth. So now let's talk about this war and just go along, follow your notes as we cover the war in the Pacific. So just to start, I want you to look at the map here of the Japanese Empire as of 1942. You can see that they covered a wide swath of Asia at this point. And, to be honest, their empire was bigger than the German Empire in Europe. Now, a lot of that is ocean, but still you got a lot of islands and things, and you can see that a lot of the colonies of like the Dutch East Indies and French Indochina and the British Burma there had been conquered at this point, or at least some fighting was still going on, especially in Burma. But the area I want to focus on first is the Philippines. So you can find that there in the center of your map. See my cursor there on the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines were a territory of the United States since the 1898 Spanish-American War. We bought it from the Spanish, and then, of course, we had to put down our own rebellion there in the Philippines. But this was kind of an operating base for us in Asia, and strategically, it was very important to us. The Philippines are actually going to be attacked by the Japanese about a day and a half, roughly, after Pearl Harbor is bombed. So if you recall, talking about Pearl Harbor, we knew something was coming. I told you we just didn't really know where. We thought the Philippines may get hit. The commanding general there was Douglas MacArthur, which you can see in the picture up there somewhere, with his aviators and his pipe, which he was kind of known for. He believed the attack was coming there, and he kind of routinely would write Congress and ask for more supplies, for maybe even more manpower at times. But when they do attack, when the Japanese do attack in 1941 at the end of the year, he'll have about 80,000 troops under his command. It was kind of a mixture of American and Filipino troops. A little bit more about MacArthur here. He's going to be like your Patton and Eisenhower and even George Marshall as far as they're going to be famous for World War II and their conduct of the war. MacArthur, the background on him, he was a World War I hero. He had served in France, highly trusted by a lot back in Washington. So he was put in charge of the Philippines. He was not known for following orders. We've actually talked about him before when we talked about the bonus army in 1932, if you can remember what happened to them. If not, you need to look it back up in your notes. But he was in charge of that, and it did not go well. And in fact, it'll be his reluctance to follow orders that will eventually get him fired during the Korean War by Truman. But that's a story for a different time. But MacArthur for months had been asking for more supplies to better equip his troops against a potential Japanese threat. So when the Japanese do invade the Philippines, the defenders there are kind of quickly outnumbered and overwhelmed to an extent where they have to start retreating. They will eventually retreat down what is known as the Bataan Peninsula. And this included the roughly 80,000 soldiers, as well as about 20,000 civilians in the Philippines there. And MacArthur will be ordered to leave and head to Australia. Now, he was reluctant to do so at first, but this would have been, of course, bad had our top general been forced to surrender in person. One of our top generals being captured would have been very bad for morale. So Roosevelt course, orders him to leave. He eventually does. And when he leaves, his troops don't fare very well. A lot of those guys were suffering from malaria and dysentery, and they were kind of running out of a lot of their supplies they had there. And eventually they will have to surrender there in the Philippines. Now, this will bring about, or this comes about rather in May of 1942. So they kind of hold on there for several months, but eventually they will have to surrender. And they would suffer at the hands of the Japanese. One thing I want you to keep in mind during this war is that the Japanese military follows some of the samurai ethos. And one of those is that surrender is the ultimate dishonor. Thus, they treated POWs poorly because they saw, like I said, they saw surrender as a dishonorable thing to do. So they didn't treat you too kindly if you did surrender to them. So the captives on the Bataan Peninsula, which you can kind of see on the map there to the left, there's about 78,000 that were force marched 65 miles to prisoner of war camps. This becomes known as the Bataan Death March. They were starving and exhausted. Many of them fell sick during the march. The Japanese and Korean guards denied them water. Of course, if they fell behind, they were either clubbed or possibly even bayoneted to death. A lot of the guards would humiliate them as well. According to one U.S. soldier that survived, there was one incident where he saw a Filipino soldier that was falling behind. The Japanese guards actually just kind of grabbed him and threw him in front of some passing tanks, which then proceeded to just kind of run over him, and there was really nothing left of him when they were done. So that kind of gives you an idea of what this was like for these guys. And you can see on the map there, you can kind of follow the red line. They marched roughly 65 miles. Some of them were forced as far as 80 miles to these prisoner of war camps in the Philippines. 600 American soldiers, as well as around 10,000 Filipino soldiers will die during the Bataan Death March. So for POWs captured by Japan, it's not going to be a very happy story for most of them. Now, after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt wanted a morale booster for the country to get kind of a small amount of revenge against the Japanese. He asked his military advisors to come up with a plan to try to bomb Tokyo, which is the capital of Japan. Now, remember, you looked at that map, you saw how far spread Japan's empire was. So this is not going to be easy. Japan was too far away to leave from an air base, so they're going to have to use aircraft carriers. So the plan becomes that they would use B-25, and you can actually see them down there in your picture, B-25 long-range bombers to take off from aircraft carriers. Now, these planes were not designed to take off from aircraft carriers. So the guys that were on this mission, led by, which way is he? He's over there. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, will have to train for quite some time on how to get these big planes off these aircraft carriers. Now, planes like you see there were designed to take off from runways at a base that was stationary, not an actual aircraft carrier. They were designed for smaller planes. But the problem is we're too far away. We can't leave from Pearl Harbor. It wouldn't make it there. We have to leave from an aircraft carrier. So we want to use these B-25 bombers. So they trained for quite some time to prepare. The next problem is they couldn't carry enough fuel to actually make it back. And plus, they couldn't land on these aircraft carriers, even if they could make it back to the aircraft carrier. So the plan becomes they kind of stripped these planes down to really nothing. They had literally, they took the machine guns out that were there for protection, all that. They put like broomsticks painted black, and stuck them out just for looks. They stripped it down to barely anything. Gave them just a little bit of reserve fuel and pretty much just the bombs and the crew that was on there so that they can make weight and take off of this aircraft carrier. And the plan was bomb Tokyo and a couple of other cities and then crash land in China. China was an ally of the United States during World War II. But there was a danger involved because if you didn't make it farther enough, you would crash land into territory that Japan controlled at the time. So this is it's not a suicide mission, but it's one of those missions that could become, something you earn a medal for because it's very dangerous. There was, a good chance they wouldn't make it back. So Doolittle will lead what becomes known as Doolittle's Raid. This will take place on April the 18th of 1942. The next day, after we dropped the bombs on Tokyo and a couple other places, headlines around the country will read, Tokyo bombed, and people will celebrate. Now, this is several months. You remember Pearl Harbor was in December of 1941, so this is several months after we are striking back. Now, what actually happened? The bombs were dropped on Tokyo and a handful of other cities, and the planes flew to their limits and crashed in China. However, some of the guys were captured by Japanese troops. Of those captured, one guy will die in prison. 3 others are going to be executed after they are put on trial and charged with bombing civilians and machine gunning a school. The damage, there was actually very little material damage done by this raid. The government of Japan actually made no official acknowledgement of the attack, and most citizens had no idea, outside of Tokyo, had no idea that what had even happened. But there was a psychological effect of the Doolittle Raid on the Japanese military because this showed them that they were indeed vulnerable to American bombs. Now think about this. They hit us at Pearl Harbor, where our Pacific Fleet was stationed, and that was huge. But we have just dropped bombs on their capital, and we are just getting started in this. So you have to imagine that has some psychological effect on the Japanese military. Now, our first engagement with the Japanese will come at sea in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And I'll show you again on the map here in a little bit where this actually takes place at. But we do know as the battle in the Pacific begins, the Japanese really have 2 big objectives. The first one is to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which they have somewhat done at Pearl Harbor. The second is they want to cut off supply lines to Australia. This was kind of all discovered by American Japanese code breakers. So we're studying some of the codes of the Japanese that we're intercepting from the Japanese and deciphering kind of what they're doing. So we have a little bit of an advantage throughout the war as we did a really good job breaking down some of their codes. But the Japanese wanted to attack around New Guinea, and that's kind of in the South Pacific, just north of Australia. And like I said, their objective here was to cut off our supply lines going into Australia and maybe potentially even invade Australia. The U.S. and Australia are going to be allies in the fight in the Pacific. And as we intercepted codes as to what they wanted to do, we sent part of our Pacific Fleet to kind of head them off. They will engage them in the Coral Sea, which is just kind of northeast of Australia. The battle will last from May the 3rd through May the 8th. And this battle is going to make history as being the first battle where all the fighting was done with aircraft carriers. The 2 fleets, so the Japanese and the American fleets, were actually 175 miles apart in the ocean. So they never even actually saw each other. No shots were fired by surface ships. Everything was done by planes taken off from aircraft carriers. We get kind of a draw in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese do withdraw on May the 8th. So they withdraw from the area. We're able to keep our supply lines to Australia open. And we do save Australia, but we, in the process, will lose, as you see in the picture there, the USS Lexington, one of our aircraft carriers. So, whether we won or lost is kind of debatable because we do take some hits, some heavy losses, not just the Lexington, but some other ships as well. But in the end, we do get the Japanese to withdraw. So it's a little bit of kind of give and take there with the Battle of the Coral Sea. So I have this map. You can see it is down here. If you see or see if I can make a pointer. This thing, yeah. So, well, it's going to keep popping up. But down here in this area, when this thing moves, you will see the Coral Sea, May 1942. So you can see how close to Australia the Japanese were getting. So don't get distracted by all the arrows just quite yet. We will come back to this map some throughout your PowerPoint. The next area, though, we're going to focus on, and this is a very important battle, is a month later. Up here, if you follow the red dot at Midway. Now, this is very important. Some of y'all may have seen the movie that just recently come out called Midway. I have not seen it yet, but this is going to be a very crucial battle when we look at the course of the war in the Pacific. So here's the Battle of Midway. Basically, after the fight in the Coral Sea, the Japanese turned their attention to our base on Midway Island. Again, one of their objectives is they're trying to draw out our Pacific fleet, covering up the picture here, so if I can move. They're trying to draw out our Pacific fleet into this one big engagement that will be decisive. That's what they're trying to do. They tried to destroy it at Pearl Harbor. They didn't. They want to meet it again in battle. They think they can do some damage to it. So they do know that some of it is stationed at Midway. Midway is very close to Hawaii. It's just kind of northwest of Hawaii. It is named Midway. You can probably guess this, but I'll tell you, it's named Midway because it's midway between the continental U.S. and Asia. So strategically, it's important to us. The Japanese, once again, they want to draw out our Navy. They also could potentially take Midway Island and possibly use it as a base, a kind of jumping off point to invade Hawaii, possibly. So this is going to be a crucial battle. We actually learn about Midway. It's kind of an interesting story how we figure out that they're going to attack at Midway in June of 1942. Our code breakers had discovered that the Japanese's next objective was being labeled as AF. That was kind of their code name for it. And we were trying to decipher what place had they labeled as AF. So what we did was we had operators, our radio operators on Midway, actually put out a fake call that said they were running out of fresh water. And of course, not too long after that, the Japanese, we deciphered a code that said AF is running out of fresh water. So there we knew that, okay, we sent this out from Midway about running out of fresh water. Now they're saying that AF is running out of fresh water. Bada bing, bada boom, we've deciphered basically that they're about to try to attack at Midway. So we actually have the upper hand going in. They don't know we know we're coming there. That makes sense. They don't know that we know that they are coming there. That's what I meant to say. And so we're kind of setting up a little bit of an ambush now for the Japanese. So on June the 4th, 1942 at 4:30 a.m., the Japanese begin their attack on Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, which I'll have on the next slide, I believe somewhere you'll see his picture, but he's the commanding officer of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And he's the one designing this trap, essentially. And he's going to sacrifice some of our defenses on the island of Midway to do that. The U.S. Navy was hidden kind of off the horizon. So if you can kind of imagine in your mind, the Japanese have started to launch this attack on our bases on Midway Island in the Pacific. And just out of sight, so miles and miles off the horizon, our U.S. Pacific Fleet has stationed quite a large chunk of that fleet waiting to counterattack. And they don't know we're there. Once again, they don't know we're there. So as they're preparing, so they've hit Midway and they start preparing for a second attack on Midway. So their planes have landed and they're getting ready to start adding bombs back on and also kind of refueling the planes, getting ready to attack again. Their spy planes do notice, not spy planes, but their scout planes notice that they finally see the Pacific Fleet kind of out on the horizon. And so the Japanese have to make this decision. Now that they know that we're out there, do they continue to attack Midway or do they get ready to attack the Pacific Fleet? So they decide to try to engage our Pacific Fleet. So they start refitting their planes. So you use a different type of bomb when you're attacking an aircraft carrier versus attacking a base on land. So they're in the process of refitting all this stuff. So if you can imagine on the decks of their ships, they've got, fuel hoses out there. They've got bombs, torpedoes and stuff that they are switching out for their planes. And the American pilots or the American bombers that take off, they take off and arrive kind of where they believe the Japanese are at around 9 o'clock in the morning, only to find out that they had, kind of missed where they were supposed to be at. And so our first attack on the Japanese Navy was botched. Some of the planes actually were so far off target that they ran out of fuel and crashed in the ocean. Others that actually got there were shot down by these superior Japanese Zeros. These are small fighter planes that were really quick and were just kind of picking off some of our small bombers. And so, by almost 10:30, it kind of looked like this was going to be a disaster for America. Our planes that had taken off and attacked had done like hardly any damage whatsoever. But at 10:25, basically the gods of battle smiled on us, and we had a squadron of dauntless dive bombers that had found their way to the Japanese ships, and they come descending in from the clouds down on top of the Japanese aircraft carriers that, remember, have, planes that are being refitted. So they got bombs kind of strode out all on the decks. They've got fuel hoses where they're trying to refuel some of their planes, preparing to try to attack us. All that is just kind of this torch that is waiting to be lit. And we failed so far to even get to those aircraft carriers. Now, these dive bombers come in, they light up the decks of these ships. It becomes a huge success. We destroy 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers in the process. And the Japanese will lose 332 planes. A ton of good pilots will be killed. They will counterattack after this, and they will sink the USS Yorktown or damage it to the point where we had to scuttle it and sink it ourselves. But this will be a huge win. They will eventually have to withdraw, and Midway will serve as a huge turning point in the Pacific. Much like we talked about Stalingrad being a turning point over in Europe, Midway will be a huge turning point. From this point on, we are going to be pushing back and winning victory after victory, heading towards Japan. So, okay, so see if I can get myself out of the way here. I'm going to go down here. Okay, so let's talk about overall strategy. After Pearl Harbor, the Allies, like I said, to start this, would kind of make the Pacific a secondary theater. We're going to focus on Europe. We are going to be fighting in the Pacific, obviously, but we're going to focus on Europe. One mistake we talked about at Pearl Harbor was the fact that the Japanese had failed to destroy our aircraft carriers. They took out a lot of our battleships and a lot of other support ships, but the aircraft carriers weren't there. So we actually started using those, as you can see in the Coral Sea and Midway. We're going to start using these to our advantage and hitting back sooner than what the Japanese assumed we would be able to do. The strategy in the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, which is up there on the left, he's going to be the commander in the Pacific, as I just mentioned, at Midway. And after Midway, he will begin advancing through the kind of central Pacific. So when you go back and look at that map, or when we have that map again, he's going to be kind of going right through the center with the Navy and attacking a lot of those islands with the Marine Corps. And we're going to be kind of hopping from one island to the next. And this is just basically referred to as island hopping. We're not going to attack every island. We're going to attack the ones that are strategically objective and important for the U.S. And we'll kind of talk about that as we go through. But and we're not going to look at every battle. We're just going to hit some of the high points. MacArthur at the top right, with the classic aviators on there, he's going to lead troops in an effort to retake the Philippines. So when he had to withdraw from the Philippines, even though he didn't want to leave, he kind of made this promise to the people there that he would return. So that is what his key objective is. So he's going to kind of be working his way through the South. Just imagine where Australia is, working his way up to the Philippines, and Nimitz is going to be leading the Navy through kind of the central Pacific, hitting some of those islands. The geography of the Pacific just a note on it. As you see in the picture over here, this kind of Amtrak, this amphibious tractor. The geography is going to be a lot of small islands. Some of these are going to be coral reef atolls, so they're going to be islands surrounded by coral reef. So this is going to make the fighting kind of hard in some cases, but we're going to use a lot of these landing craft because we're going to have to do a lot of amphibious attacks, just like we talked about with North Africa and even on D-Day. We're going to have to do that quite a bit in the Pacific because we're fighting on islands. So going back to what I was talking about, see if I can move me again over here. What I was talking about with Nimitz and the Navy, they're going to be moving kind of through this central location here. And MacArthur and the Army, and generally the Army, is going to kind of be moving through this chain of islands up towards the Philippines. So they are going to work together, of course, at different places, but that's kind of the overall strategy. We're going to island hop, hitting certain ones, not hitting certain ones. So you can see by the map here some of the key battles that were fought on the way to trying to get closer to Japan. Fighting in the Pacific. So MacArthur's campaign in the Pacific will begin with the invasion of Guadalcanal. And there's really no good way to put myself here. You can kind of see what's going on. But Guadalcanal, if you go back and look at that other map, which I will do real quick, wrong way, it's located down here in the South Pacific, close to Australia. So the Japanese, on Guadalcanal, the Japanese had been building a huge airbase on the island, which they were going to use to kind of strike at the U.S. military, also strike at Australia. So on August the 7th of 1942, 19,000 Marines, with the support of Australia as well, landed on Guadalcanal. And their objective was an airbase there. As I mentioned, the Japanese were building an airbase, and they kind of easily do secure the airbase. And they actually start using what the Japanese left behind to continue and finish the airbase so that we could use it. But the airbase was the easy part. The hard part was trying to kind of control the island and maintain and hold the airbase, because the Japanese will send in reinforcements, both sides. Over the course of 6 months at Guadalcanal, will send in reinforcements. The fighting there will be very intense. The Japanese refer to it as the Island of Death during the war. The Japanese lost 24,000 of the 36,000 that were sent there to fight. So they take huge losses. For America, we had about 16 soldiers that were killed. We had another 4,200 roughly that were wounded at Guadalcanal. So you're going to see these lopsided numbers quite a bit during the war, until we get to like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and we'll come back to that idea later on. But the Japanese, the fighting there is intense. I mean, we talked about just a second ago how a lot of these battles are going to be amphibious in nature, meaning we're going to have to land, in these Amtraks, these amphibious type vehicles that can go from sea to land, typically under heavy fire from the Japanese, trying to take these islands. And the Japanese, let's just face it, they were kind of suicidal in nature. We're going to talk about the kamikazes here in just a minute. But in a lot of places, in a lot of these fights, I mean, they're going to fight to almost the very last soldier. There's not many of them that would surrender. And that goes all the way back to what I was talking about earlier about this idea of a samurai ethos, and that it was dishonorable to surrender. So they typically don't surrender. And as you can kind of see up there in the picture, that's actually one from Guadalcanal at the top, and all the bodies land there. It's going to be harsh fighting. I made this comment back when we were talking about Europe. A lot of the guys in Europe, especially during the winter at times, would think about some of the soldiers in the Pacific, and they would envision them over there, in the warm tropical climate, on these Pacific islands, surrounded by pretty girls who are bringing them drinks and, that they're just having a good time. But for the guys in the Pacific, it was a much different story. The fighting will be more intense than it was in Europe because the Japanese were suicidal. At times strapping bombs to themselves, running headlong wave after wave into machine gun fire. It was just very intense. So, and civilians on the islands were problems as well, because the Japanese had convinced a lot of these civilians through propaganda that American soldiers were monsters who would, rape their women, murder the children, just terrible things they believed we would do to them. So a lot of cases you had mass suicide, like in Saipan there, I've got at the bottom for you, where 8,000 civilians died by jumping from cliffs rather than being captured by American soldiers, because they had been brainwashed to believe that we were going to do terrible things to them. So just a different war altogether in the Pacific than what you're going to see in Europe. And the fighting was intense in Europe, don't get me wrong, but this is going to be very intense fighting. So here's another picture. I don't know if you have this one on yours. I guess maybe you do, of Amtrak's, these amphibious vehicles. And there was different designs. They were actually developed in Florida, like down in the Everglades in the swamps. And of course they were, manufactured heavily throughout the war, sometimes just referred to as alligators, but a lot of times Amtrak, so amphibious tractors. But they're going to be highly used. Now, sometimes these things got stuck. They didn't always work to a T, like at Tarawa, where 5,000 Marines basically had to wade ashore. They had to jump off these things because they got stuck on the coral reefs, and they had to sit there and wade in chest deep water as Japanese machine guns are firing off at them. So, give or take, these were good, but they also had their problems at times. All right, another major battle. So we mentioned Midway being a turning point. Another key objective was, of course, the Philippines. Going to be very intense fighting here in the Philippines. And remember a little while ago, I said that MacArthur had kind of vowed to the people of the Philippines that he would return to liberate them. It was one of his key objectives in the Pacific. So in October of 1944, so we've jumped ahead quite a bit here, but in October of 1944, we had about 700 ships. So a huge part of our Pacific fleet, and about 160,000 troops that will invade the islands to try to dislodge the Japanese. If you look at the map down there, you can see that the Japanese kind of suspected us to attack at Luzon. That's the top island, the biggest island up there, where the capital of Manila is located. But we didn't. We attacked at Leyte, down there kind of in the middle islands of the Philippines. But the biggest part of the battle is actually going to take place on the water. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is going to be the largest naval battle in history. When the American fleet learned that the Japanese fleet to the north, or learned that the northern force, if you're looking over there at the map, Ozawa's northern force, when we learned where they were at, we actually divided up our fleet. Halsey went north with the 3rd Fleet, and Kincaid and the 7th Fleet stayed to kind of support our troops as they invaded the island of Leyte. Now, this was kind of what the Japanese wanted. If you really examine the map there, you can see that the Japanese had already kind of split up their forces, their naval forces. And the reason they sent the northern force to the north was to kind of lure away a lot of our fleet, and they wanted to ambush the rest of them. So as you look at that map, you can see that Shima's force and the southern force kind of come together and creep through the different islands and basically ambush Kincaid's 7th Fleet. And what emerges is this huge naval battle off the coast of the Philippines out there. And this is where you will first see kamikaze attacks that are going to be used. And I think I've got one. Yeah, you can kind of see it on this next slide here. There are going to be over 424 kamikaze pilots that will embark on suicide missions. And they will sink about 16 ships. So these are basically just human missiles that they are, as you see in the picture, they're flying into our battleships or even aircraft carriers at times, trying to sink ships. Oftentimes with the torpedoes or bombs still attached. So you may be wondering, why did they start using these kamikaze attacks? They haven't been doing it yet. Now, most people know what a kamikaze is. You've probably heard that term before, but they weren't using it throughout the entire war. They start around the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And one of the main reasons why they start doing this is back in June and July of 1944, so a couple of months before this, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they lost a ton of experienced pilots. Like, America just went to work on them, and they lost a ton of experienced pilots. Some Americans refer to that battle as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because we were shooting down so many of their planes. So the loss of experienced pilots left them in a situation where they had a lot of inexperienced pilots. So they kind of depicted this as gaining a badge of honor by going to sacrifice yourself for the emperor in a kamikaze attack. Kamikaze means divine wind, named after a storm that destroyed the Mongol fleet. Sorry, I can't get it out. In the 13th century, as they tried to attack Japan. That's where that word comes from. They will use these as a strategy. And we'll talk about, as I mentioned on a previous slide, how they were suicidal. We'll come back to that idea in some other battles as well. In Leyte Gulf, the Japanese eventually will withdraw because they believed actually that the Americans, if you go back and look at this map, they actually believed that the Americans were about to ambush them. So even though they had kind of ambushed us, they end up withdrawing because they think we're kind of planning the same thing. So again, this was a huge naval battle. We have now got troops on the islands, and we will start working our way up, and there will be very intense fighting around Manila, the capital, to the north up there in Luzon, as you can kind of see it on the map. The other picture I didn't reference is over there, is MacArthur. That's him with his some of his staff, and they are marching through the shallow waters going to Leyte. And it's kind of funny, he has a press conference shortly after we had taken the area, and kind of famously says, "Peoples of the Philippines, I have returned." And that's something he vowed to do. So we will start working our way through the Philippines at this point. And you can see Leyte Gulf and all that down there by the Philippines. And you can see the course of the war so far as we are working our way through some of this. Now, let me go back real quick. The next island I want to look at is Iwo Jima right here, a very famous battle, as you probably just saw. And as I'll show you, the famous iconic picture of the Marines and soldiers kind of hoisting up the flag there on Mount Suribachi. Iwo Jima is going to see very intense fighting. Probably, I keep using that word, intense, and we're mainly just talking about kind of the big battles here. So all of them are going to be intense, don't get me wrong, but this one is going to be on another level. Why did we invade Iwo Jima? It's a very small island. And in fact, on my old PowerPoints, I used to actually have a picture of the island from an aerial view, and it's not very big. And on the southern end of the island, there's actually this dormant volcano, Mount Suribachi, which I just mentioned a second ago. It's actually where they're hoisting up this flag after we took the islands. But we attacked this small island because we needed a base. We needed a place where our planes could take off from to better attack the actual homeland of Japan, the home island of Japan. We were attacking from Saipan, and we were still kind of out of range. So taking Iwo Jima, going back to this map, we were kind of sending planes from here, and it was still a little bit too far. So Iwo Jima was the next best option, and we take it, we can actually bomb Japan much easier from there. So in February of 1945, we will invade the island of Iwo Jima. That mountain I talked about on the southern end was actually a dormant volcano, and it created this weird terrain where you had kind of the sand mixed with ash and the waves crashing up on that. When guys jumped off their landing craft and started storming the beaches there of Iwo Jima, they kind of got stuck in this soft sand, water, ash mixture and made it very hard. And the Japanese just kind of unleashed a ton of firepower on our guys that were storming the shores there. And we had about 60,000 Marines that landed there on Iwo Jima. They slowly fought their way inland. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, the Japanese at this point were pretty much suicidal in their attacks. We had to use, because they had a bunch of caves, kind of a network of caves on these islands like Iwo Jima, and then we'll talk about Okinawa next. And we basically had to use flamethrowers in a lot of cases to kind of get them out of these caves, to run them out of this network of caves. Sometimes we would dump napalm in there and throw a grenade and kind of light it up and just wait for the guys to run out and just shoot them as they ran out. But this is a significant battle because this is the first time that our casualty count, remember casualty is dead and wounded, it's the first battle where we're going to have as many casualties as the enemy. We had 23,000 casualties. 7,000 of those are going to be guys that were killed. So the rest are going to be kind of severely wounded. And the Japanese are going to have about 22,000 dead and another 200 captured on the island of Iwo Jima. So, when you look at those numbers, they obviously had more killed than us. But as far as the total casualty count, this was by far the worst we had seen so far. And at Iwo Jima, we really start to question, what is it going to be like if we actually invade the island of Japan? We really start to wonder, what will the death toll be if we actually try to invade the home island of Japan? So, again, you can see on the map here, I got this map on there a lot, but you can see how much closer Iwo Jima is. So this is a key location for us to, again, bomb Japan. Now, we've already been doing it, like I mentioned, but this is going to help us in that endeavor. See if I can move myself. So General Curtis LeMay was, I don't have his picture on here, obviously, but he was the commander of the B-29s that were based in Saipan, which is in the Marianas Islands. So before we got to Iwo Jima, that's where we were bombing from, as I showed you on the map. And he's going to ultimately be the guy that kind of decides to start using incendiary bombs, or fire bombs, as they're called, filled with napalm. This kind of jellied-like substance that is really hard to put out, and it's kind of spreads rapidly. The reason we start using incendiary bombs is because originally when we were leaving from like Saipan and going to bomb cities in Japan, we had to fly at such a high altitude because fighter planes that protect our bombers could not fly that far. So these big B-29 bombers, now they've got a bunch of guns on them and a bunch of guys that are trying to protect the plane from, Japanese fighter planes that are coming. It was still very dangerous. So to protect our flight crews and stuff, we would have to bomb from a really high altitude. So it was ineffective. The accuracy was really low. So we make the switch. And we start, instead of, we talked about in Europe how we kind of had this moral objective not to try to limit civilian casualties. We won't do that in Japan, in the Pacific. We will kind of flip a switch, and in an effort to get the Japanese to surrender faster, to kind of give up faster, we will start using these incendiary bombs because we could drop them from a really high altitude, and they would hit, and they would after they explode, the fires would kind of quickly spread around the city, and it would eventually take out our target. Now, our targets were still military in nature. I mean, we were aiming for like aircraft factories, things that are making stuff for the war. But it means that civilians are going to be killed, which is obviously bad. So there's no better example than the firebombing of Tokyo, which is one of the most destructive bombing rates in history. Basically, it kills over 90,000 to 100,000 civilians. When we firebombed Tokyo, it'll destroy over 250,000 buildings. A lot of the structures built around Tokyo were actually built out of wood. And so they were basically like paper cities that just kind of caught on fire, and the explosions from the firebombs, because you got to understand there's a bunch of planes dropping out a whole bunch of bombs, and it's creating basically this fire windstorm that these fires have started, and then they are spreading rapidly, and the wind and the explosions and stuff like that are just creating this this traumatic experience there for the people that were alive, the people that were being attacked. So the fires, when we firebombed Tokyo, you could see them from like 150 miles away. That's how intense it was in the city. It left over 1 million people homeless. And as I mentioned, it was the most destructive air raid in history up until that point. By the end of the war, America would firebomb 67 Japanese cities. So you will have this level of destruction in 66 other cities. We were using about 500 bombers every other day. So, the Japanese will continue to fight, but their ability to produce the things they needed for the war will be dramatically reduced because of our bombing raids, as well as there will be numerous civilians killed in a lot of these raids. And you can see pictures. I don't have any on here, but you can just see pictures if you look at the firebombing of Tokyo of just groups of people just on the ground, charred, burnt, just blackened, where they burned to death because they couldn't escape. You'd see just burnt black bodies floating down the river, hundreds of them, where people ran and tried to jump in the river to try to get the flames off of them, and they would die. So it's very, destructive bombing and questionable, definitely. But, it is war, and the objective is to defeat the enemy and get them to surrender. So there were several cities that were left untouched. By design, we selected several Japanese cities that we did not firebomb because we have another bomb we're developing, and we want to save some of these cities for possible objectives to use those bombs on. And I think you probably know which bombs I'm talking about. We'll get to those in just a minute. So the next objective, I'm going to backtrack to our map here real quick, is going to be, so we got Iwo Jima now, where we are dropping bombs from Iwo Jima onto cities in Japan. The next objective, a couple of months later, is going to be Okinawa. Now, Okinawa is quite a bit bigger island than Iwo Jima. And the idea behind taking Okinawa was that it was a closer island where we could possibly launch an invasion from, if we so choose to invade. So we need a good launching off point, and that's what Okinawa is going to be. So this starts in April of 1945. 170,000 U.S. troops advanced onto the beaches of Okinawa. But unlike a lot of the island invasions, we're actually going to advance unopposed on Okinawa. There were 77,000 Japanese troops and about 20,000 Okinawan militiamen that were there waiting for us. But they let us advance inland because their plan was to basically draw this out on Okinawa into a war of attrition. And what that means is a long war that results in a ton of casualties. And the idea was at this point, the Japanese knew that, well, maybe they didn't know, but they probably started believing that defeat was inevitable. And they're going to want to, hopefully find some type of peace agreement before we actually invade Japan. They want us to reconsider invading Japan. So they're going to try to inflict as many casualties as they can here on Okinawa. And that's exactly what they do. They let us advance. You can imagine being soldiers who have invaded other islands and they've been, fired on when they're coming through the water, trying to take cover. And all of a sudden, this eerie situation on Okinawa where you're advancing and there's nobody there. Like nobody's shooting at you. And it wasn't until a couple of miles inland into Okinawa that we finally engaged the enemy. So this is going to be another one of those battles that is going to be, very brutal in nature. The Japanese were kind of entrenched everywhere on the island. Once we got in, they had these caves, kind of like on Iwo Jima. They had these tunnels that they would come out of and attack us. And you can actually see one in the picture up there. You see that square kind of carved out in the side of the mountain there. Just very, very intense fighting on Okinawa. The Japanese, at this point, had limited munitions on the island and no effective long-range weapons to use against our tanks that we landed there on the island. So what they started doing on Okinawa was basically strapping these 22-pound bombs and creating these like kamikaze-type soldiers that would, strap this bomb on and run and just kind of jump under a tank and blow up to try to destroy the tank, because they had no other way at this point on Okinawa to try to take out our tanks. So, you've still got kamikaze attacks going on, attacking our ships out there, and now you have these like kamikaze soldiers attacking tanks, and it's just a scary situation to be involved in if you were there. So on Okinawa, the results you can see on the screen there. We will have around 12,000 Americans die. I've actually seen some accounts that put that a little bit higher. But the results for the Japanese will just be horrendous. There'll be 70,000 that will die. So only 7,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered of the original 77,000 that were there. The rest of them were all killed. So the Okinawan civilians will also kind of suffer during this battle. As you can see on the screen there, 100,000 of them will die on Okinawa as well. So again, very intense fighting. And the reason for that was that the Japanese wanted us to reconsider actually invading the island of Japan. So we'll come back and look at this one more time. And so here's Okinawa. So we are prepared potentially to invade. We know that there's going to be a high casualty count if we do. So we have island hopped our way across, and I've talked to you about some of the major battles from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, to Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. So I'm going to stop this first video, hopefully, if I can figure out how to do that. And then I will make another one that you can go back and watch that will talk about the atomic bomb and the end of the war in the Pacific. So, all right.